I asked 50 Christians over 40 why they're still single. And honestly, I expected to hear the same things I always hear. I haven't found the right person. I'm trusting God's timing. Maybe a few stories about past hurt. What I got instead was something I wasn't prepared for, because the answers were layered, specific, and, in a lot of cases, backed up by research that most people in the church have never seen. So, today I want to share what I actually found, and more importantly, what it means for you if you're walking through this season right now. Here's what most Christian dating content gets wrong from the start. It treats still single at 40 like it's one problem with one answer. Like there's a single wound to heal or a single lesson to learn, and once you get there, the relationship shows up. But researchers have actually cataloged 92 distinct, named reasons why people stay single. 92, organized into 18 categories across 4 different life domains: poor flirting skills, fear of getting hurt, valuing freedom, having different priorities, being too selective. These aren't made up, they're documented, and most of them have nothing to do with faith at all. So if you've ever sat in a sermon wondering why the "just trust God" message doesn't quite land for your situation, it's probably because your situation is more specific than that message was designed for. Now, before we go further, I want to say something that might surprise you. One of the most counterintuitive findings from this research is that older singles, people in their 40s and beyond, are actually less likely to be single by choice than younger people are. Over 22% of younger singles in one large cross-cultural study said they were voluntarily single. Among older participants, that number dropped to around 8%. So the cultural assumption that people who are still single in their 40s must have settled into it or gotten comfortable alone, the data says the opposite is true. Most of them would rather not be. That's not a small detail. That changes the whole conversation. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because the reasons men and women gave were almost mirror images of each other. Men were more likely to say they stayed single because they wanted freedom. Freedom to move, to pursue goals, to not be locked into anything. Women were more likely to say they stayed single because they were afraid of getting hurt, or because they didn't see themselves as desirable. And when I sat with the 50 people I interviewed, that pattern held up in a striking way. The men weren't lazy or indifferent to marriage. Many of them were carrying a pressure they'd never named out loud, the feeling that they weren't financially ready, that they hadn't figured out their calling, that they couldn't walk into a relationship until they had something to offer. The church rarely talks about this. We talk about men needing to step up, but we almost never acknowledge the invisible bar that men feel they have to clear before they even try. That's important, but if you think the women's side of this is simpler, it's really not. The women I spoke to had their own specific kind of weight. Several of them were highly educated, professionally accomplished, and quietly navigating a tension that researchers have actually given a name to: the conflict between following social expectations to marry and continuing to pursue their own goals and achievements. These weren't women who didn't want love. They wanted it deeply, but they'd built meaningful lives, and they weren't willing to shrink those lives just to fit a script. And the cost of that wasn't just staying single. It was the constant, exhausting labor of explaining themselves to everyone around them. Family members who assume something must be wrong. Church communities that treat them like a problem to be solved. People who can't imagine that a woman in her 40s could be genuinely okay and still genuinely hoping for more at the same time. That invisible tax, the burden of constant justification, is its own kind of loneliness, separate from the loneliness of not having a partner. Now, I have to stop here and talk about something that almost no one in Christian spaces is willing to say directly. A significant portion of the people I interviewed came of age during the purity culture movement of the late 1990s. I kissed dating goodbye, true love waits, the pledge cards, the rings, the whole framework. That generation is now 40 to 50 years old. And a 2009 study found that within 5 years, sexual activity among pledge signers was statistically on par with non-signers, meaning the pledges didn't hold long-term for most people. But the shame did, the anxiety did. And when these men and women weren't married by 30, many of them were left with a question they didn't know how to ask inside the church. I did everything right. Where is my reward? That unspoken grief, that specific kind of disappointment, showed up in my interviews more than almost anything else. And researchers have gone even further, documenting that purity culture's perfectionism can produce real clinical outcomes, including performance anxiety, disordered eating, and in some cases, a clinical fear of sex called genophobia. These aren't fringe experiences, they're patterns, and they deserve to be named, not vaguely gestured at with words like baggage. That's important, but if you think this is all about individual wounds, there's a structural layer to this that most people have completely missed. Here's a stat that stopped me cold when I first read it. Over a 2-year period, 63% of single Christian women in the church had not been asked out by a single man from their own congregation, not once, in 2 years. The average single Christian woman was more likely to be asked out by a non-Christian than by someone sitting in the same pews as her. And when you look at the data on why, part of the answer is a gender ratio problem that sociologists studied decades before it became a church issue. When women significantly outnumber men in a social group, men, often without consciously realizing it, raise their standards and reduce their commitment because the math gives them more options. This isn't a character flaw, it's a documented behavioral pattern, and it played out inside churches for about 25 years while the ratio was heavily female skewed. Here's the twist though. As of 2025, that ratio has flipped. For the first time in 25 years of Barna tracking, more men attend church weekly than women, 43% of men versus 36% of women, driven largely by Gen Z and millennial men returning to faith. The people I interviewed grew up in one reality. The dating pool around them is now shifting into something completely different. Most of them don't even know this is happening. And marriage rates overall have dropped 31% since 2000 and 61% since 1970. So, the 50 people I talked to aren't outliers. They're the leading edge of a 50-year trend line that most people have never seen laid out clearly. Now here's something the research gets right that I want to make sure we don't skip over, because it matters for how you think about your own life. Singleness itself doesn't automatically produce poor well-being. What actually determines your psychological health is whether your singleness is voluntary or not, and whether you've built meaningful relationships around you regardless of marital status. Lifelong single people, especially women, show physical and mental health outcomes that are largely on par with married people by later life. They tend to seek out what researchers call chosen family, deep friendships, community, people who show up. The financial penalties are real. Single income, no shared benefits, a social security system built for couples. But the health outcomes tell a different story than the cultural narrative does. That doesn't mean singleness is painless. It means the pain is more specific than we usually admit, and so is the path through it. If this video is hitting close to home for you, I want to ask you to do something right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, which of these reasons resonates most with your own experience? Is it the fear of getting hurt? The pressure of not feeling ready, the exhaustion of explaining yourself to everyone around you? Because your answer matters, and I genuinely read these. And if you want to go deeper on any of the threads we talked about today, the purity culture piece, the gender ratio shift, what the research actually says about building meaningful relationships in your 40s, I've covered all of that in videos linked right here. Subscribe if you haven't, because this is the kind of conversation I come back to regularly, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. So, let me bring this back around to where we started. I went in expecting to hear 50 versions of the same story. What I found instead was 50 different people carrying 50 different specific weights. Some rooted in fear, some in freedom, some in a church culture that handed them a script and then didn't know what to do when the script didn't work out. The research backs all of it up. There isn't one reason people are still single at 40. There are 92 named reasons, and most of them are more nuanced, more human, and more understandable than the church has usually been willing to say out loud. What changed from the beginning of this video to the end is this: still single stopped being a mystery and started being a map. And when you can see the map clearly, when you can actually name what's going on, you stop blaming yourself for being lost, and you start figuring out where you actually want to go.